The Devil of Darbury, written and read by Chris Halton. Around 20 years ago I settled in Darbury, a village consisting of small but delightfully compact thatched stone cottages and much larger tiled Georgian townhouses, all nestling snugly against a verdant pastureland of hills and interspersed woodland neatly divided by the bubbling stream of the winding river Barnbrook. With a local dairy, a greengrocer, a hardware shop and a butcher, it was complemented by a small school and a family doctor. In many respects, it was a place where time had stood still, apart from the ghastly intrusion of the motor car, which infrequently arrived with sightseers putting all the horses and dogs to fright, and of course the hourly resonating peal of the tower clock at St. Michael's Church, which, according to locals, was added as a celebration of Nelson's victory over the French following the Battle of the Nile in 1798. As Henry James, the local solicitor and commissioner for oaths, my days were filled with legal matters concerning the local farmers and gentry. Yet my true passion lay in the village museum, a charming timber-frame coach house I had the honour of curating, a role that often led me to unexpected discoveries. My decision to settle in Darbury was deliberate. I wanted to escape the bustling pace of a London practice and enjoy a more serene existence. Despite my years of service and familiarity with the locals, I was often regarded as an outsider, a label that faded when my expertise was needed to resolve disputes, a service I offered freely. But to the point, and away from this painted scene, I recall a very odd and sad story that happened a few years ago. Nearby the village is the Sowerby estate, consisting of a large but rather turgid 16th century timber-framed house that received something of a makeover in the 18th century. A plastered brick front with a Georgian portico entrance was added to give it a more modern appearance, as was the day's fashion, and was punctuated with rows of dreary sash windows, which gave charmless austerity to its relatively plain appearance. The current owner was the local squire, Sir Trinian Montague, a rather brusque and often jovial character, but a genuinely decent individual who resembled a latter-day John Bull, being somewhat corpulent in physique with bushy sideburns and a large, round, pasty face decorated with bright red cheeks and a short but unruly mop of brown hair. He claimed he could drink anyone under the table when challenged, and enjoyed the company more of his workers than of his fellow landed gentry. Sir Trinian owned 10,000 acres of pasture, and with his herd of cows was the primary milk supplier in the district. He also owned the village dairy where the milk was processed, and gave donations regularly to the poor. As such, I rarely had any social contact with him, as most of my dealings were confined to legal matters. However, occasionally he dropped off some interesting Roman finds dug up on his land for display in the museum, or I went to his home to discuss legal work. But in all of these circumstances, contact with him was minimal. That changed on a cold and drab February afternoon in 1920, when I attended by pony and trap Sby Hall at the urgency of his request to discuss something he described as odd. He assured me this was not in a legal context, but regarding my knowledge as an antiquarian. Having arrived in a heavy rainstorm, a footman met me with an umbrella and escorted me into the hall. After removing my hat and raincoat and passing them to the footman, I joined him in the drawing room, which was heavily beamed and wainscoted and had a roaring fire in a Bessemer fireplace. After greeting me and shaking my hand, he welcomed me to sit in a winged armchair beside his, placed in front of the fire. Having been given a warming brandy, he sat down and said, "Don't know where to begin, old boy, but here goes." He sipped his brandy and continued. "Down in the cellar, I had a builder and his team demolish an old brick side wall which was collapsing and needing replacement. The builders propped up the floor beams above, as we all agreed it was a supporting wall, and that if it collapsed, it would take half the house into the cellar." He paused briefly and continued. "You can jolly well imagine my surprise when we discovered a void beyond instead of stone and dirt. They quickly cleared sufficient space to enter, and a workman with a lamp went in. Shortly after, a scream of terror followed, and the worker scurried out quickly and in a state of shock. Gaining my interest, I said, "And what did your workmen find there?" Looking quite serious, he replied, "A walled-up room with a stone sarcophagus bound by rusting chains, a sight that sent collective chills down our spines." He paused again and, with now trembling hands, poured another brandy, which I declined for myself. "And, sir?" Taking a gulp, he replied, "Well, the chains, although very old, were impossible to remove without help from the local smithy, who agreed to attend the following day in the company of the village doctor, who also, as you know, is the local coroner, as we suspected someone's body to be present. We all went down there in a group, safety in numbers, eh? But having arrived there, we were shocked to see the chains were removed and the stone lid on its side against the sarcophagus. It was empty, save for a parchment scroll written in ink with weird characters. He then handed me this delicate item, which was still quite legible. The unexpectedness of the discovery left us all in a state of disbelief. It was written in ancient runic characters, a language I knew little of. Having agreed to allow me to keep it for translation, we went to the cellar where, as described, the sarcophagus remained. Looking at it in more detail, I observed that it bore Roman characters carved into the side wall, which I translated from Latin, which read, "Lucretia oxor pontae maximi, animam eus in pars requirunt da," and in English as, "Lucretia, wife of Pontius Maximus, may the gods rest her soul in peace." How very strange, I remarked. A Roman coffin with a runic Norse parchment and unbound from chains with nothing within. I looked at a very worried Sir Trinian. I asked whether he had conducted any investigations to establish how this had arrived here, and more importantly, whether staff or other interlopers had entered this chamber to remove its contents. He replied, "Well, old bean, you did see I unlocked the cellar door to get in here, and it was still locked the morning it was opened, and I have the only bally key." Having satisfied myself that there were no obvious other secret entrances, we returned to our winged chairs in front of the fire, where Sir Trinian engaged his staff with searching the library for any material relating to the house. 3 double brandies later, Simpson, the butler, entered the room with a dusty leather-bound book. Although printed some 100 years earlier, it gave an account of the area's history by a noted antiquarian. He handed it to me and said, "I'm afraid, sir, that is all we have on the house." He then asked Sir Trinian, "Is there anything else you may need, sir?" By now, Trinian was somewhat, shall we say, well oiled with the brandy, and dismissed the butler with a slurring dismissive mumble under his breath. At this point, I took the opportunity to leave. As agreed, I took the parchment and book back to my office to conduct research, and assured him I would return when my work was concluded. In the interim, he agreed to donate the sarcophagus to the museum, which was duly delivered and installed the following day by estate staff. My first port of call was to an old chum from my uni days at Oxford, to whom I posted a copy of the runic text. Wilfred Owens was an acknowledged expert on what one might describe as dead languages, and the runic script was a speciality. A real boffin of the old school, I knew this would be a breeze for him. While waiting for Wilfred's reply, I read the rather weighty tome I borrowed from Trinian. Written in 1810 by Alexander Springhall, it covered the entire history of Darbury from the late Roman era, the 3rd century AD, to the end of the 16th century. It was a very well-researched work and contained much detail that was until then unbeknown to me. For example, the village was originally a Roman settlement known as Darburia. It had its garrison of Romano-British soldiers nearby, who frequently fought incursions from marauding Saxon warriors, partly caused by the waning power of Rome, which was withdrawing legions from England to fight on the continent. During this turbulent period, the area maintained a Roman governor or administrator with a villa built within the garrison fort. During the 4th century, the then governor Pontius Maximus ruled the area so effectively that the numerically smaller garrison resoundingly defeated hordes of Saxons and Pictish warriors from Scotia. It was claimed that his wife Lucretia, a woman of noble birth, was an evil high cult priestess who derived great power from the sacrifice of prisoners captured in battle. Under normal circumstances, human sacrifice was antithetical to Roman beliefs. Still, as these warriors were regarded as little more than savages, their deaths towards the higher cause of strength and stability were, in their eyes, worthwhile, as the garrison was seemingly invincible against their foes, and in time their enemies avoided their domain. But, according to chroniclers, this was not to last. A garrison member was appalled by her brutality against friend and foe, and poisoned her wine with hemlock, and she died shortly afterwards. Her grieving husband interred her body in a stone sarcophagus, which was buried within a secret brick chamber below the garrison temple, which in present times became Sby Hall. Nothing more was recorded of the garrison, seemingly disappearing into the mist of history. Within a week he wrote back to me on the translation, which he identified as Norse in origin, dating from around the 9th century. It was a stanza from Havamal, a Norse poem which translated as thus: "I can so carve and colour the runes that the man walks and talks with me." In simpler terms, it was runic magic to raise the dead to the world of the living. For it to work, it required a special ritual using human sacrifice, with the blood of the dying sprinkled upon an array of runic stones bearing this text, and whosoever was brought to life would remain alive as the living dead and in perpetuity. Of course, as he agreed with my thoughts, this was pagan nonsense, but the fact that this text on vellum should survive inside a Roman sarcophagus was at least a little disconcerting and very puzzling. Afterwards, little was recorded on the site, which was rebuilt in the 14th century into an aisled medieval hall that developed over time into the present structure. However, the name Sowerby intrigued me. Many sites of recorded Nordic settlement ended with the letters BY in their name, and it was known that for some time Danes who invaded in the 8th century used the site as a base for further incursions inland. Certainly they would have used runes as part of their language, which may be why the runic text was found in the empty sarcophagus. My research answered many questions, but there is still no indication of why the sarcophagus was hidden, or why Danes may have left the text inside, and perhaps more importantly, what was inside it and who opened it. I returned to see Trinian at Sowerby and gave him my findings and his book. He wanted to donate the runic script to the museum. Out of general interest, I said, "Has anything strange happened here following your discovery of the sarcophagus?" He looked at me, shocked by my question, and then answered, "No, there hasn't. Why do you ask?" "No reason in particular, although the sarcophagus opening was rather strange, do you think?" He recovered and smiled. "Oh, I understand, old boy. Everything here is jolly fine, but I do agree that was rather odd." For the next few weeks, nothing of any interest was reported, and the hall and village went on into spring, with early fine weather and the impending rebirth of summer. But oddly, there were reports of livestock disappearing in the district. As there was no trace, it was assumed not unreasonably that one of the locals was engaged in sheep and cattle stealing, and that set the village to rumour and wild assumptions of guilt. Yet nobody who came into the focus of wagging tongues was ever caught with the livestock of others. Even the local police were unable to come up with any solutions either. But all this was soon forgotten as summer came into view, and the village welcomed a new resident, Lady Margaretha van der Wald, a wealthy 40-year-old beauty with raven hair and dark, smouldering eyes. She had bought one of the larger Georgian houses in the village, which came with an impressive half-acre garden filled with fruit trees and a sizable ovoid-shaped lily pond stocked with large carp and goldfish. I had yet to meet her personally, having seen her only once. A statuesque woman of good bearing, she apparently was Dutch, and having always been an Anglophile, she wanted somewhere quiet and frightfully English to live. Darbury had all these elements for which she strove. I was keen to meet her, but until builders and landscapers had done repairs and improvements, she remained in London at an apartment she owned. By July, she had returned to Darbury and finally took up residence. As the local solicitor, I was obligated to call and introduce myself to her professionally and personally to make her acquaintance. Initially hesitant, as she seemed from all reports to be quite haughty, I was pleasantly surprised to discover she was quite the opposite. By arrangement, I met her one afternoon in the garden summer house she had built next to the pond. Having been invited for afternoon tea, we sat together on lattice-framed cushioned garden seats around an ornate white-painted metal table where we both made relatively informal introductions. She was dressed in a beautiful floral-printed light dress and wore a stylish wide-brimmed summer hat, which was cocked at an angle on her head. She had a lovely dark and alluring face, so much so that she reminded me of a classic Greek or Roman beauty with a small but pert aquiline nose. Her hair was almost black, wavy and very long, so much so that it was tied back into a ponytail. With beautiful fulsome lips and a very accommodating smile, she was the image of female perfection, complemented by a perfume that wafted gently in a slight summer breeze. Yes, at first contact I was very much taken by her. After having sat for the brief formality of introduction, she said to me, "Well, Henry, how do you find life here, especially during the quieter winter months? I should imagine you have to keep yourself busy, no?" I, momentarily in awe of her soft, lilting voice, replied, "As a solicitor, there is always something to do, my lady. As an interest, I keep a small museum here for the benefit of the locals, which encourages me sometimes to research some of the artifacts passed to me. But overall, I am never bored, if that is what you are asking. And how about yourself?" She smiled again, whilst holding a beautiful gold-rimmed floral Minton teacup, and said, "Please never call me my lady. It is merely a title conferred on me by my marriage to Sir Humphrey van der Wald, who sadly passed away some months ago. He was unlike me, an Englishman with Dutch ancestry, who made my acquaintance shortly after the Great War when he was a military attaché in Amsterdam. I met him at a conference where I was a translator. It was, as you say, love at first sight, but sadly he was killed in a road accident in London, where we settled after marriage, which is part of the reason I am here." I commiserated at her loss, and she touched my hand and said almost pleadingly, "Please, Henry, I am over this sad period and look forward to making this village my permanent home. I like friends to call me Maggie, which is an English colloquialism, yes?" I blushed slightly at our acknowledged friendship and felt more relaxed in her company. She spoke a little about her past, but what intrigued me most was that she was of half-Italian ancestry, which explained much about her complexion. She was a gifted linguist who spoke apart from English and her native Dutch, Italian, French and German, and could also read Latin and ancient Greek academically. All in all, I was incredibly impressed and could not wait to make her acquaintance again. She agreed to meet me next week to accompany me to the museum. Although she still had some business in London, she assured me she would return soon. In early August, she again contacted me, and together on a hot, balmy afternoon, we walked to the museum. As the exhibits were displayed on 2 floors, we went first to the upper floor, which contained primarily medieval remnants collected and donated by the villagers. She was impressed with the collection for such a small village and commended me on my efforts to display that history clearly and informatively. But on our return downstairs, she quickly spotted the sarcophagus at the back and in a corner after looking at the Roman artifacts. With puzzlement and shock, she examined the inscribed text in detail and asked, "This fascinates me, Henry. Where did you get it?" Realizing that explaining the story and my investigation would take some time, she agreed to accompany me back to my home, a relatively small apartment above my office on the village high street. Having made her comfortable in my lounge, I fixed a cooling drink, and we both sat at the dining table where I shared my research story. After 20 minutes of studying my notes, she listened to my story and cross-checked facts before sitting quietly in contemplation for a minute or so and saying, "I find it odd that the sarcophagus was found covered and chained, as if to suggest that someone wanted the occupant. of whom I suspect may well be Lucretia to remain forever in there. Yet somehow the chains were broken, and the lid was removed with only a runic verse for raising the dead being inside from presumably the later Danes. She looked distantly in deep thought and said, "Why would the Danes leave that when clearly they must have wanted her chained and bound within?" She paused and then said, "I too have academic friends who have researched ancient cults and will make inquiries on your behalf. There must surely be something in an archaic legend that can give some light on this." We agreed to meet up again in 2 weeks, and I arranged with Trinian to visit the cellar that day with Maggie to see whether she could find some clue that may have been missed. He was very agreeable to that proposition, especially as the lady was a noted beauty. In the interim, Maggie wrote to her colleagues and gleaned some information from ancient Norse, which she brought to Sby Hall. After I introduced her to a very excited Trinian, we sat in the library to discuss her findings. After being served afternoon tea and sandwiches, Maggie opened a flap over her briefcase, removing several handwritten sheets of paper containing details of her research and input from colleagues. Shuffling the papers neatly into a stack, she handed them to us and said, "Here is the total of what I have gleaned. To save going into the minutiae of detail, I will paraphrase what I have learned so far, so we can discuss going forward with this." She then allowed us a few minutes to read responses from her contacts in academia, and continued, "There is a legend of a local Anglo-Saxon princess named Liveva, who was captured by the Danes here at Sowerby. The Danish leader Athelwulf took her for his bride and built a settlement where both lived, entirely independent of other settlements in this part of Danish-occupied England known as Danelaw. Their power base gradually spread throughout this region, and Athelwulf declared himself king and Liveva as his queen. She became entirely tyrannical and was believed to possess magical powers as a priestess through an ancient pagan ritual where prisoners were slain for their blood. People gradually felt she was demonic, and the king held little power. Eventually, a group of warriors took matters in hand and attacked her in her shrine, which was described as being of ancient brick and built below the ground, where she was slain with a sword with her body placed inside an old stone sarcophagus upon which she had earlier performed her blood rituals. They then bound the sarcophagus in chains, as they believed she had the power to revive herself and seek revenge. As an added safeguard, protection runes were cut into the 4 brick walls to prevent her spirit from leaving. In short, it became her tomb. I believe Athelwulf placed the runic verse inside it before it was chained, but that, as she concluded, is pure conjecture. "So what happened to the settlement?" I asked. As the power that ruled had been taken away, it simply disappeared following Athelwulf's death in battle a few years later. Liveva and Lucretia were, I believe, the same people, and the sarcophagus used for blood ritual was central to her existence. Trinian sat there in a state of shock. "Are you saying my family home gave sanctuary to this demonic creature? You have no idea, my dear, of how that unnerves me," I interjected. "Well, let's check the cellar now to see whether any runic symbols are carved into the brickwork." Together with flashlights, we entered the cellar. Within minutes, we confirmed that runic symbols were carved into each wall, and the collapsed wall must have released this entity's spirit. But what puzzled us all was where it went. Trinian reported no unusual activity in the house or cellar, and nothing similar was found in the museum where the sarcophagus was kept. The mystery deepened. Apart from the odd sheep or cow seemingly disappearing as livestock, nothing untoward had occurred in the district. Yet none of us felt remotely complacent. At this point, I have to say that I was becoming somewhat suspect about the beautiful Maggie, with her cultured, experienced charm and looks that would convince me that she was of noble Roman birth. She arrived in the village not long after the discovery of the sarcophagus and around the time that animals were reported missing. And despite reading her convincing research, where on earth would such detail of long-lost lives still be recorded? But on the other hand, I hope she wasn't because I was becoming infatuated with her intellect and beauty, leaving me vulnerable. For the present, I decided not to share my suspicions with anyone. After all, if it wasn't Maggie, I could be playing into the hands of the real Lucretia, and that could be a tragic mistake with inevitable consequences. On the 22nd of September, a young woman employed by Maggie named Jemina Smith left her home in the village to report for work at the house where she was employed as a maid. Nothing was seen of her until 11 a.m. when another maid employed by Maggie was in the garden hanging out the washing when she reportedly suddenly screamed and ran back into the house, shouting for help in an apparent state of shock. Mrs. Besson, the cook, heard the commotion and found the maid sobbing hysterically in the hallway as she sat hunched on the floor and crying hysterically. Getting her to her feet, Mrs. Besson, a congenial lady in her 50s, hugged the girl's shoulders and said, "What's wrong, my dear?" The maid Alice, a residential housemaid in her 20s, spluttered, "Gee, minor, Mrs. Besson, oh my God, she be lying dead in them bushes in the garden." By now, Maggie had heard the commotion from her drawing room. With Mrs. Besson, they went into the garden, where Jemina's body lay only partly concealed by the undergrowth, and on examination, her skin was pallid and cold. I was at this point contacted by Maggie, who also sent a maid to bring the village doctor, who arrived around the same time as me. And sure enough, this poor girl lay quite dead in the garden. The doctor reported she had been dead for around 2 hours, and her body appeared drained of blood, although no marks on her body were found. Subsequently, the police attended from a neighbouring town, and they led an immediate investigation into her death. At the same time, her body was removed to a district hospital where a post-mortem was conducted. It came back that she had died from loss of blood, and that no trace of hemoglobin was found anywhere in her body. Yet there were no puncture marks or cuts to her flesh, and she was found dressed in her typical day wear as a maid, having commenced work at 6 a.m. There was no sign of a struggle, and her clothes were not stained with blood. The police, led by Detective Chief Inspector Byford, a stocky, well-built man with 20 years of service, were quite baffled as to how she had died. He had personally never worked on a case like this in all his years, and despite grueling questioning of staff, nothing suspicious was noted or discovered. The property as such had no direct access to the garden from the front, and the rear walls of solid brick at least 10 feet high had no rear access gate. Whoever or whatever committed this impossible crime was hiding in the garden or working in the house at the time of the crime. However, as confirmed by others, the only person with no alibi was Maggie, who claimed she was reading alone in her bedroom. I was sure she knew the answers, especially since her thorough search of the house and garden revealed no one else. However, one fact that seemingly escaped everyone's attention was that this crime fell over the autumnal equinox, which, as I knew, was a time of religious worship for some belief systems, whether good or bad. I also reasoned that if Maggie was somehow the culprit, why commit this heinous crime on her doorstep? That did not make any sense. Later that evening at 11 p.m, I heard the doorbell ring from downstairs while alone in bed. Begrudgingly putting on my dressing gown, I went down the staircase and opened the door. I was surprised to see that it was Mrs. Besson, the cook. "I am so sorry to trouble you, Mr. James, but can I confidentially speak with you?" "At this late hour, Mrs. Besson? Did your employer send you?" "Well, no, sir, she did not. And it is with her that I wish to speak to you about—" Intrigued, I invited her into my apartment and sat with her in the lounge. She explained to me that on the morning that the maid died, she saw her ladyship through a partially open door talking to her in the drawing room, which had French doors leading into the garden. They spoke in whispers, and shortly after, she opened the French doors to allow her out into the garden. She paid no more attention and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. "What time would this be?" I asked. "Oh, about 6 a.m. when she arrived to clean the rooms downstairs." "And why did you not report this to the police?" I demanded. "Because nobody would accept my word over hers, and in any case, I could have lost my job over making accusations without evidence. I know you are a lawyer and am better prepared than me to follow up on this. I replied after thanking her, Well, there is not much I can do with this, as you appreciate, so I am off to bed and will follow this up in the morning. Well, sir, I thought you should also know I saw her not 10 minutes ago enter the museum. She has a key, you know. I saw her sneak out of the house and followed her. Annoyed, I said, You could have told me this first, Mrs. Besson. We are wasting time standing here. I knew Maggie had a spare key to the museum I had given her, so I was now more inclined to believe Mrs. Besson, and what she told me confirmed my worst fears. Hurriedly donning an overcoat and hat, I accompanied Mrs. Besson to the museum, which was locked. I assumed she had secured the door upon entry to avoid raising any suspicion about her visit. I suspected she was there to see her sarcophagus, and figured this was the perfect opportunity to catch her engaged in some dubious activity. I instructed Mrs. Besson to remain quiet as I carefully unlocked the door, and we entered. I expected to see her as I turned on the light, but there was no sign of her presence. I turned to Mrs. Besson and said, She has left. We are too late. To my surprise, Mrs. Besson smiled and replied, You are quite wrong, sir. We have all the time in the world. With that, an unseen, invisible force hurled me across the room and into the side of the sarcophagus. At the same time, Mrs. Besson seemed to float towards me, barely off the ground. A weird incandescent light emanated from her body, causing it to diffuse slowly into a grey misty ether, which swarmed around me, and at the same time I felt as though I was becoming dehydrated, and then I felt the life force being sucked out of me. Just at that moment I was about to give up and expire, for I knew I was dying. The museum entrance door opened, and I could see within the greyness of this mist the figure of Maggie, who spoke in Latin, Exorcisamos te, omnis immunde spiritus, omnis satanica potestas. As she spoke, the mist began to dissipate, and I felt my life force restored as the mist coalesced into an impenetrable grey mass, which was absorbed by the stone sarcophagus. As the mass entered, she took the original runic parchment scroll and ignited it, then dropped it into the sarcophagus. Upon contact, everything was engulfed in a golden fire that reduced it to nothingness. All that once remained in Trinian's cellar was gone. She quickly came over to help me back onto my feet. Henry, she said, I have destroyed this evil and you are safe. It will never return, as the sarcophagus was its lair. We then returned to her home, where she made me comfortable in a lounge chair with a stiff drink and immediately began explaining herself. I came to this village after you wrote to a friend and colleague, Wilfred Owens. He alerted me to what had been found there, so I decided to move into the village under the pretext of wanting to live to identify and destroy this creature. I could not reveal my true intentions, for had I done so, this evil that was once Lucretia would have destroyed me first. I had suspicions about Mrs. Besson, who once lived like you and me. But this evil needed a body as a host, and the poor lady who was weak of will and spirit provided it. Sadly, nobody must know of this lady's passing, and of course, in all likelihood, her disappearance will make her a suspect who will never be found. So you used me as a sacrificial goat to bait it? Yes, and I do apologize profoundly, but I can assure you that you were being watched at all times and were safe, despite your misgivings earlier in the museum. And I knew you were beginning to suspect me as the perpetrator. But everything had to be done this way because Lucretia was part of an ancient coven of nefarious evil entities that a 15th century German Catholic clergyman, Heinrich Kramer, identified and pledged to destroy. She then explained that Kramer was in fact the author of a book on demonology called the Malleus Maleficarum, first published in 1487, and followed the papal bull Summis Desiderantes, which Pope Innocent VIII published in 1484. However, Catholic clergy soon turned on him, and so adherents of his teachings formed a secret society that pledged to destroy this evil wherever and whenever it was found. She added with some relief, I am the last of the line, just as Lucretia was. She embraced me warmly and said, Dearest Henry, I want to continue living here, and better still, I want to spend my life with you. We both kissed and were married within a few months, and without the necessity of detail, our life is blissful. I never did find out what had happened to those missing animals, and Maggie presumed that the creature named Lucretia had consumed their flesh and blood entirely as energy. But like many things in this weird world, we will never know. The end.